It is the 24th of June, 1940. A grey dawn is breaking over the River Clyde in Scotland, and the docks at Greenock are alive with a kind of controlled, deliberate silence. There are no crowds, no brass bands, no fanfare of any kind. A group of men, soldiers, bank officials, and naval officers, are moving crates. Hundreds of crates. The boxes are unremarkable in appearance, roughly the size of a small suitcase, bound with steel straps and stamped with seals that most of the men loading them have been ordered not to examine too closely. Each crate weighs somewhere in the region of 60 kilograms. Moving one requires 2 men and considerable effort. They are loading these crates onto a warship, HMS Emerald, a light cruiser whose guns have been stripped back and whose lower decks have been quietly cleared of their usual contents and refitted for an altogether different kind of cargo. Nobody on the dockside is told exactly what is in those boxes. The sailors handling them can feel the weight, the unnatural density of it, a solidity that seems wrong for the size. A few men will later say they suspected. But in June of 1940, Britain is not a country in which curiosity about military operations is encouraged. France has just fallen. The Germans are at the Channel. The Prime Minister has been in office for less than 2 months and is already steering a nation that many governments privately believe will not survive the summer. The crates keep coming. Lorry after lorry pulls up to the dockside, each one escorted by armed guards. They are loaded through the night and into the morning. When HMS Emerald finally slips her moorings and moves out into the Clyde estuary, she is carrying something almost impossible to comprehend: the combined financial reserves of half of Europe, compressed into physical gold and negotiable securities, destined for the vaults of Canada. The exact figures remain staggering even by modern standards. What sailed on that ship and on the vessels that followed in the weeks to come represented a sum so vast that historians still argue over its full equivalent in contemporary currency. Conservative estimates place the total transferred across the Atlantic during the summer of 1940 at somewhere between 40 and 50 billion pounds in today's values. Some put the figure considerably higher. This is the story of Operation Fish, the most audacious, most secretive, and most successful financial operation in the history of warfare. It is the story of how Britain moved the wealth of a civilization across a submarine-infested ocean in the middle of a losing war, and kept it secret for years. And it is the story of why that gold still matters, not merely as a historical curiosity, but as evidence of what human beings are capable of when everything is genuinely on the line. To understand why Operation Fish existed at all, you have to understand the particular horror of the spring of 1940. The German offensive, launched on the 10th of May, had within 6 weeks achieved what 4 years of grinding attritional warfare had failed to accomplish in the First World War. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were overrun or in the process of capitulation. The British Expeditionary Force had been rescued from Dunkirk, but had left the vast majority of its heavy equipment behind on the beaches. Britain stood, for the first time in modern memory, genuinely alone. And the financial implications of that fact were almost as alarming as the military ones. Modern wars are expensive in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate. Aircraft need aluminium, rubber, high-octane aviation fuel, precision instruments, and specialist alloys that Britain could not produce in sufficient quantities on its own. Tanks need steel, copper, and machine tools. Warships need armor plate, turbine components, and range-finding equipment. The one country in the world with the industrial capacity to supply all of these things in the volumes that Britain needed was the United States. And the United States was not at war. Under the terms of American neutrality legislation, Britain had to pay cash for everything it bought. No credit, no deferred payment, no promises. Hard currency handed over at the point of purchase. Britain's gold and dollar reserves at the outbreak of war had been substantial, but 18 months of rearmament and 6 weeks of military catastrophe had burned through them at a terrifying rate. By the early summer of 1940, Treasury officials were running calculations that pointed toward a single, deeply uncomfortable conclusion. At the current rate of expenditure, Britain would exhaust its ability to pay for American supplies within months. Without those supplies, the RAF could not be maintained. Without the RAF, the Channel could not be defended. Without the Channel, the country fell. The gold, therefore, was not merely wealth. It was survival. It was the physical, tangible foundation upon which the entire British war effort rested. And therein lay the problem. The gold was in Britain. The factories were in America. The Atlantic between them was being systematically patrolled by German U-boats, whose captains had already proven, with mathematical efficiency, that they could sink almost anything that moved on the surface of the ocean. The challenge was not simply to move the gold. The challenge was to move it without anyone knowing it was being moved, because if the Germans discovered that Britain was transferring its entire financial reserve across the Atlantic, the political and strategic consequences would have been unthinkable. For the neutral nations watching from the sidelines, for the occupied countries wondering whether resistance was worthwhile, and for the British public itself, the image of the government quietly loading its gold onto ships and sending it away would have looked exactly like what it partly was: a hedge against defeat. The man at the center of the solution was a figure not widely celebrated in popular history, but remarkable in the annals of quiet British competence. Sir Edward Peacock, a Canadian-born director of the Bank of England, was tasked with coordinating the operation alongside officials from the British Treasury and the Royal Navy. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its scale. Britain would move its gold not in one vast, conspicuous convoy, but in a series of carefully staged shipments, using warships rather than merchant vessels, routing them through Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the cargo would be transferred to armored lorries and transported by special train to the vaults of the Sun Life building in Montreal, a location chosen for its physical robustness and its continental distance from any possible European threat. The gold itself came from multiple sources. The Bank of England's own reserves formed the core, but Britain had also agreed to transport the reserves of allied and occupied nations. Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium had all shipped portions of their national wealth to Britain for safekeeping as the Germans advanced, and now all of it needed to move further still. The Belgian government alone had managed to evacuate a significant portion of the National Bank's reserves before Brussels fell. A story involving French trains, West African ports, and a series of decisions made under conditions of extreme duress that deserves its own documentary. That gold, too, ended up on British vessels heading west across the Atlantic. The physical logistics of the operation were staggering. Gold, in the quantities involved, cannot simply be stacked in a lorry like furniture removals. A single standard gold bar of the kind held by central banks weighs approximately 12.4 kilograms, roughly equivalent to a large bag of potatoes, but compressed into an ingot the size of a brick. It is extraordinarily dense. A wooden crate holding 20 such bars weighs close to 250 kilograms, roughly the mass of 2 adult men and a large dog, and it must be handled with care because gold is actually a relatively soft metal, and the bars, if dropped or knocked together roughly, can be damaged in ways that complicate later assaying. The lower decks of HMS Emerald on that June morning in Greenock were being transformed into something resembling a floating section of Fort Knox. Every available space packed with crates, wedged and secured against the motion of the sea, guarded by armed ratings who had been told, in the bluntest possible terms, what would happen if they touched anything they were not supposed to touch. The ships used for Operation Fish were not cargo vessels. They were warships, cruisers and destroyers that had been temporarily repurposed, their fighting capacity somewhat reduced by the volume of gold crammed below decks, but their speed and defensive armament retained. This was a deliberate calculation. A merchant ship, however large, could not outrun a surfaced U-boat on the open ocean. A cruiser could. The hope was that speed and firepower would compensate for what was lost in stealth. The convoys, where they existed, were kept small and routed unpredictably, using weather information and intelligence reports to avoid known submarine patrol areas. HMS Emerald completed her crossing in 6 days, arriving at Halifax on the 1st of July. She was met by a security operation of considerable scale. Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, Bank of Canada officials, railway guards, and the quietly impressive logistical apparatus of a country that took its responsibilities to its mother country extremely seriously. The gold was unloaded, transferred to the armored train, and moved to Montreal, where it joined the growing contents of the Sun Life Building's vaults. The building itself, one of the largest in the British Empire at the time, had been quietly assessed as one of the most structurally robust in North America. Its basement vaults, reinforced with concrete several meters thick, were judged capable of surviving almost any conceivable attack. The irony that Canada's tallest skyscraper had become the temporary home of European civilization's accumulated wealth was not entirely lost on those who knew about it. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Over the following weeks, more ships followed. HMS Revenge, HMS Bonaventure, HMS Emerald made a second crossing, then a third. Merchant ships, traveling in fast convoys and carrying sealed and mislabeled crates, supplemented the warship transfers. In total, somewhere in the region of 2,229 boxes of gold and a further 4,800 boxes of securities were shipped across the Atlantic between June and November of 1940. The securities, bonds, share certificates, foreign currency holdings were equally vital, representing British-owned investments abroad that could be liquidated to purchase American goods. Their physical transfer was, in some ways, even more complex than the gold, since paper documents require careful climate control and are vulnerable to the damp conditions of a ship's lower decks in the North Atlantic. Throughout the entire operation, the Germans appear to have had no specific intelligence that it was happening. U-boat commanders were not given special orders to intercept gold shipments. the Luftwaffe, conducting its preliminary raids on British coastal targets that summer, made no special effort to strike the Clyde docks on the evenings when shipments were being loaded. Whether this was the result of successful British deception, German intelligence failure, or simple good fortune is difficult to say with certainty, even now. What is clear is that not a single gram of gold was lost in transit. Not a single ship carrying British reserves was sunk. In an ocean where the Germans were destroying a significant percentage of everything else that moved, the gold got through. The German position on the movement of capital during this period is instructive, if only by contrast. The Reichsbank's approach to wartime finance was fundamentally different from Britain's. Germany had, since 1933, operated an increasingly closed economic system, a managed economy in which gold's role was carefully restricted, and the regime relied more heavily on internal credit creation and the systematic looting of occupied nations' reserves to fund its war machine. By the summer of 1940, German gold holdings were substantially augmented by the reserves seized from Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Low Countries. Though this presented its own considerable challenges in terms of assaying, legitimacy, and the longer-term relationship with neutral trading partners who were being asked to accept gold whose provenance was questionable at best. The Americans, meanwhile, had their own extensive gold reserves secured in the famous facility at Fort Knox in Kentucky, a purpose-built depository completed in 1936 and constructed with the explicit intention of holding a significant proportion of America's monetary gold. Fort Knox, with its armor-plated vault doors and its ring of security, represented the American approach to the problem. Build something enormous and impregnable, and keep everything in one place. The British approach, by contrast, was to build nothing, use what existed, and move everything before anyone realized what was happening. The contrast tells you something about the difference between a country that has not been seriously threatened for a century and one that is facing the imminent possibility of invasion. What Operation Fish actually achieved, in both practical and strategic terms, is difficult to overstate. In the most immediate sense, it worked. The gold arrived in Canada, remained secure throughout the war, and provided the financial foundation for the British purchasing program in the United States that sustained the RAF, re-equipped the army after Dunkirk, and kept the Royal Navy at sea. The Lend-Lease program, announced in March of 1941, eventually reduced Britain's dependence on cash purchases. But by then, the most dangerous period had already passed, and it had passed partly because the reserves shipped across the Atlantic had bought the time needed for Lend-Lease to be conceived, negotiated, and implemented. The psychological and political dimension is equally significant. Had the operation failed, had a German U-boat happened upon one of the cruisers carrying a full load of gold and sunk it, or had German intelligence discovered the shipments and publicized the fact, the damage to British prestige and British resolve would have been profound. The image of a government evacuating its wealth while calling on its citizens to stand firm would have been politically devastating. That it was kept secret, and that it remained secret for years after the war, was itself a small miracle of official discretion. Most of the sailors who participated understood something unusual was happening, but the specific details, the quantities, the destinations, the full strategic rationale, were not widely known until historians began piecing the operation together from declassified documents decades later. For the occupied nations whose gold had been entrusted to Britain, the outcome was similarly significant, if sometimes bittersweet. The Polish gold, evacuated by train and ship in scenes of considerable drama in September of 1939, eventually made its way through Romania, Turkey, Syria, and France before reaching Britain and then Canada. The Norwegian government in exile received its gold back after liberation. The Belgian situation was more complicated, involving extended disputes and documentation challenges that took years to resolve. But the fundamental point held: the gold survived the war, which meant that the nations it represented retained a material foundation for reconstruction that would have been absent had it fallen into German hands. Surviving records suggest that some of the physical gold spent the entirety of the war in the Sun Life building vaults in Montreal without ever being touched, simply sitting there in the dark, accruing the status of a collective financial conscience for a continent that had temporarily lost its way. The building itself still stands on Dominion Square in Montreal, though it ceased to be the Sun Life Company's headquarters some decades ago. The vaults are no longer in use for their wartime purpose, but the building's granite facade and its enormous scale still convey something of the confidence, or perhaps the determined optimism, of those who chose it as a hiding place for a world's worth of wealth. Return for a moment to that Greenock dockside in June of 1940. The crates are still coming off the lorries. The sailors are still straining under their extraordinary weight. Somewhere in that grey dawn, a young naval rating is told to stop asking questions and get on with it. And he does, because this is Britain in the worst year of the 20th century, and getting on with it is what is required. He does not know that he is participating in one of the most consequential logistical operations of the entire war. He does not know that what he is loading onto HMS Emerald will eventually help pay for the Spitfires and the Hurricanes and the radar stations and the tanks and the merchant shipping and everything else. That will, over the following 5 years, grind the German war machine to a halt. He knows only that the boxes are heavy, that the ship needs to leave before dawn, and that nobody is asking for his opinion on any of it. That is, in the end, what is most remarkable about Operation Fish. Not the gold itself, though the quantities involved are genuinely extraordinary. Not the secrecy, though the achievement of keeping an operation of this scale hidden in the middle of a war is remarkable by any standard. What is most remarkable is the matter-of-factness of it. The people who designed it were accountants and naval officers and civil servants. The people who executed it were sailors and dock workers and railway guards. They were not heroes in any dramatic, cinematic sense. They were competent people doing an extraordinary job, because the alternative was to allow everything they had spent their lives building to fall into other hands. 2,229 boxes of gold, 4,800 boxes of securities, every ship arriving safely, not a gram lost. In the summer of 1940, when Britain was losing almost everything else, it did not lose the thing that mattered most, and the Germans never even knew they had missed it.